I'm ready, Chair. I don't know if I can be seen or if my presentation is available to be shared by the Secretary.
Can you share the presentation?
Okay. Okay. Morning, Chair. Morning, everybody.
Yes, but we don't see the presentation.
It should be coming up.
The presentation is there, Chair.
Okay. You can proceed.
My name is Andre Duplessis from the Cannabis Action Group. I started the Global Cannabis March section here in South Africa 23 years ago, and we've been peacefully demonstrating to the steps of Parliament for the past 23 years. So excuse me if I'm not as polite as some of the previous people, but it's been a long time for me, more than 5 administrations. I, like others that have presented before this round, will make sure that I only focus on the hemp tax-on that the uninformed members of this committee have presented so proudly as their homework. But before I continue, I need to point out that if the committee members had in fact done their homework, I would not have to speak here today. In my previous presentation, both written and oral, I gave indisputed evidence of the hemp research that the government has performed over the past 2 decades to the cost of more than 1 billion rand. And yet, here we are. No scientific evidence for 1 billion rand, not a jot, to justify what you call hard work. If you had listened to just me or read just my presentation, this would have been apparent. But not only have I been ignored in the saliva on the paper public participation process, but so have all the other presenters who have raised the exact same topics, and the thousands of marchers that have marched to the steps of the Parliament over the past 23 years for the liberation of cannabis. Instead, what do we have? Further definition insanity. More bad definitions that will be a gaping corruption hole and the criminalization of citizens. I have not seen this government make any representations to the International Code of Area Nomenclature Board to change the phytosociology or well-defined words to match the cockamamie definition in this bill. I say no for these reasons. The harm, THC, that these legislators want to lock me up and others for, like I presented last time, slip and slide up and down the harm scheduling at the threat of legal action. And I, like others, and like I presented last time, are exactly like the vaccines that we authorized for use, which were not regulated by molecule, like cannabis is here, which means the billion rand scientific yardstick is broken. Because it's becoming abundantly clear that the molecules in the vaccines appear to be much, much more harmful than cannabis over just the past 3 years, and even since my last presentation. Yet, depending on your chosen deity, the slip-slidey harms of a molecule vary. The slip-slidey harms of the molecule also vary between private and not private. And I'd just like to question the science that informed this committee, because what has been printed in this bill shows that THC, the harmful molecule, can exist in 3 different states at exactly the same time. Now, to me, the only thing that can explain this is quantum science. And I hope in the questions and answers, we can figure out a little bit more about this quantum science. Were the molecules in the vaccine scheduled by harm, religion, private or not in private? So before you judge me with your limited understanding as a criminal, let me school you. On the screen, you are seeing the average UVA and UVB that reaches the planet's surface in a year. Red is lots of UVA and B, and blue is very little. Please focus on the 40-degree latitude that runs between Canada and America, through France and Spain, and through Athens, Greece, and in the south through Chile and New Zealand. The blue zone does not get much UVA and B because of the general water vapor in the atmosphere. To put it simply, it's a UV thing. THC is created through a bioenzymatic process created by the cannabis genus when exposed to UVA and UVB. These are well understood and standard nomenclature terms. In other words, scientific terms that are obviously too complicated for this class and time. So back to the colorful picture to simplify. Here above the line where the white people live, hemp, because it doesn't produce THC. Between the two lines where there's lots of red, and there's lots of sunshine, lots of UVA and UVB, cannabis, brown people live there. Anyway, these hemp inclusions and new definitions and the previous ones that I raised before will ensure through the lack of understanding of this picture and where hemp grows and where hemp doesn't grow will fail by what is already included in black and white in the hemp edition through its definitions and its THC percentage. I said before, had terrible definitions. And here we are 2 for 2. That's exactly something that's actually worse than the previous bill. And right there is an example of how a bad bill introducing bad law can be removed from the table. The legal advisors of this committee actually retorted to our previous presentations that Parliament does not have to engage in public participation every time it changes the law. In the case when definitions are changed to a language that seeks to criminalize citizens outside of internationally understood nomenclature, that is exactly why and when Section 195 public participation is required. Members of this committee, the legal and health regulatory advisors, have often cited the Single-Use Convention Treaty as the overarching guidelines. But here's the thing. I'm not presenting to the World Health Organization or the United Nations. I'm presenting to the South African Parliament. And on top of that, last time I presented the existing levels of latitude allowed in the existing treaties of member states not to criminalize their citizens. And as an example, there's the whole of America, a signatory example, yet here we are. Further to that, and in closing, as if the definitions used in the bill aren't bad enough and Eurocentric, from above the blue zone, hemp definitions are being applied here in Africa, and these sitting legislators are choosing to criminalize citizens based on no science whatsoever. As for the term approved cultivars, we've just recently had an experience of approved vaccines. Do you think I'm going to trust the government when it comes to approved cultivars? Anyway, I have a serious question I hope to get in the questions and answers, because to me, this smells like regulatory capture. What's on the screen? I'm just going to leave up to the legislators.
You have 2 minutes left.
Obviously, you haven't seen it, or again, this bill would not look like this. What you have is the new World Health Organization principles that encourage not criminalizing member state citizens for all drugs, not just cannabis, but all drugs. Now, if the legislators had seen this, this bill wouldn't look like this. If the legislators are choosing to do what they are choosing, despite not having the science to back it up, I make a few predictions, one promise. Every African who invests in hemp, as defined in this bill, will lose everything instantly. The bill is nonsense, complicated, and corruption will be resolved. This bill will face opposition in court if this committee continues. My promise is I will hold every legislator accountable for choosing to make us criminals if you choose not to listen to us now and saliva on paper this public participation. Thank you. Are there any questions? Chair, last time there were no questions presented to me, but as this is a two-way street, I actually have some questions of the legislators, if I can be accommodated.
Members, are there any questions? This time is reserved for members and the department to ask questions, not any other person.
I just need to understand how we got to this, so surely the legislators could just give a little more clarity with some specifics.
So members, we are fine. There's no question. Thank you very much. Mr. Duplessis.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Okay, of Mr. Makubete, when it comes to...
Sorry, can you raise your voice? It's difficult to really hear you.
Mr. Makubete, when it comes to the scheduled harms of THC that's used in this bill to justify the types of criminals, what exactly was presented to you that made it seem logical, if not scientific, that one molecule could be defined in three different ways: public, private, medical, non-medical, religious, non-religious? And yet you have three different chemical effects, and in some settings, those chemical effects would require criminalizing citizens. What science was presented to you that made this logical, Mr. Makulubete?
Thank you very much. Is that the question you have?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Mr. Makulubete, would you want to answer now, or you will come when you respond to everybody who has made inputs?
Yes, Chair, thank you. I'll rather answer the question now. However,
Okay.
I will come back when we do the summary, when we present the summary. But for now, at least for Mr. Duplessis to keep it at the back of his mind as to where we are coming from when it comes to what we have in the bill. It has been raised from yesterday and even from in the past that the Department of Justice is not responsible for the commercialization, that we are aware of. But as the department, we are responsible for the courts and the criminalization of a certain act. Right now, with this bill, we are responding to the direction and the order given by the Constitutional Court in the Prince judgment. I must reiterate, because that is the very basic foundation of us as the department to have this bill the way we have it now. The Constitutional Court gave an order to decriminalize the use, the possession, and cultivation of cannabis. And the way it was done by the court was to leave it open for Parliament to come up with the quantities that will be sufficient, because the Constitutional Court was specific that what can be legitimate or legalized will be the sufficient cannabis per adult. That is enough for one adult for personal consumption. Now, what we have in the bill is strictly to comply with that, to say that here are the amounts that are limited for an individual for possession and use. And these are the number of plants that we consider to be sufficient for personal consumption. And now, the Constitutional Court, if I may go back to the point that was raised there, in relation to dealing in cannabis, the court was specific that it will not decriminalize dealing in cannabis. Now, what we have done is to at least give those prescribed quantities so as to also avoid the potential of dealing in cannabis.
No,
Yes,
Mr.
Chair.
But if I understand Mr. Duplessis' question, he will correct me if I'm wrong. In determining those quantities, what did you rely on? I think that is his question. If I'm wrong, Mr. Duplessis, you will correct me.
I think that's how I understood it as well, Chair, but I will get straight to it. What we did was we considered various pieces of legislation from different countries. The table, we have formulated a table to determine as to how many quantities are determined by the various countries, and we have
specific question. My specific question is, how is it that this bill has ended up deriving 3 different scenarios for one molecule? And some of those scenarios end up in criminalization. That just doesn't make any scientific sense. And my question was specifically, what science informed this? That was my question, is what science informed this?
Thank you, Mr. Duplessis.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Let me get this straight to that question. As I was saying, we looked at the practices from different countries to check how do they legislate the use and possession of cannabis. And we drawn from that. We could not get a scientific determination of what will be sufficient for personal consumption or what will be sufficient plants for cultivation. We used previously determined quantities of cannabis and cannabis plants. That's where we come from in relation to this. Various countries have determined 6, others 4, others 7, and they differ like that. And we have determined 4 plants for our country, and then we
sorry, Mr.
Makulubete. Thank you, Chair.
Sorry, Mr. Makulubete. Mr. Duplessis, can you mute yourself?
Okay, I'm concerned scientific science didn't.
Mr. Duplessis, can you mute yourself? Thank you very much. Proceed, Mr. Makulubete.
Yes, Chair. In conclusion, I was actually concluding to say that we do not have a scientific measure of determination of what will constitute the sufficient amount for personal consumption. And the quantities that we have in the bill are in accordance with what I can call practices from different countries. And then we drew from those, and then we invited comments to ask the members of the public to assist us in coming up with the sufficient numbers or quantities, and we still stuck with that. And because people are not assisting in as far as the quantities are, what quantities can be included in the bill. And now, obviously, Chair, when these when there are limitations like we have in the bill, if those are exceeded, then there will be a contravention of the law, and then there should be penalties for that. That is what we have in the bill. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Honorable Masako Taylor.
Thank you, Chairperson. I think now, Chair, we are the whole thing is becoming clearer, because I just want to apologize, because when this bill was introduced to us, Chair, if you remember, it was the time when I was in the hospital during those times, so I could not get some of the documents go through properly as we normally do. So my apology to that, Chair. That's why I was requesting that maybe if one can be also given more, so that we can also, when we deliberate, go to this one go into the details. But now what makes me also to be kind of not settled with the explanation that we get from Mr. Makulubete is the issue that the courts said we should decriminalize this. And in decriminalizing this, they did not give us the specifics. They left this thing to Parliament. That's what, if I'm mistaken, please correct me. And secondly, Chair, here we are now. Mr. Makulubete says he considered other countries' researches or what is happening in other countries. My concern now is that we went outside without considering the situation in South Africa. Hence, we find ourselves where we are. And if I'm not mistaken, Chair, at some point before I went to the hospital, I know that there was a presentation from SAPRA about this matter, about the THC levels and all those things. It means what we are having now, you'll correct me, Mr. Makulubete, and the team, what we are having now, it is something that talks to Europe. Like yesterday, we got some presenters, Chair, saying to us this bill currently in its formation, it answers or it is Eurocentric. It doesn't talk to us in South Africa. So it means that if we have to twinkle or change or do whatever that we need to do from here, is it possible for Mr. Makulubete to go and consider the South African situation in a manner speedily that is informed by the presentations that we get now? I think he understands the situation in terms of, we don't want to finish this bill that is not talking to the situation in our country, in talking to the issues that has been raised here. And we don't want to find ourselves again in front of the Constitutional Court answering also these issues of saying, instead of decriminalizing, we went back, like, if I have to take words from the presenters, to apartheid and take some of the things that makes this bill to be also not giving freedom to our people. So this is my comment, Chair, on this matter, because we have to consider all those presentations, and Mr. Makulubete must go back and look at the situation in South Africa and talk to that situation, Chair. That is my proposal on this one. Thank you. If I'm out of order, Chair, correct me. You'll help me. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Makulubete, do you want to respond? Or do you
Yes.
respond to the summary
Yes.
that you bring?
Thank you, Chair. Let me respond in full when we come back with the summary, because now we'll have to search for the documents where we have identified and tabulated different countries and their experiences. What I can say for now to Honorable Maseko Jele is that we don't have a scenario in the country in terms of how much is sufficient for personal consumption. That is why we looked outside. And it's not Eurocentric. We also looked at African countries, because we do not have those quantities in any legislation in as far as this cannabis is concerned, for the obvious reason. That is why we are here. And we are trying to come up with the quantities that will be sufficient, and then we invited comments on that. The comments are not forthcoming because the intention is to have a full-blown decriminalization of cannabis. That is without restriction. And that cannot work because we as justice cannot do that. We cannot commercialize. That is why in our bill, we're making for provision for other department for a national legislation. Could be Department of Agriculture, Trade and Industry, is the department that is going to come up with a commercialization legislation for cannabis. So people do not want restricted quantities, and we as justice cannot give open-ended quantities. That will be left for national legislation. However, Chair, in terms of the documentation, we will be able to come up with that when we come back to the committee during the briefing on the submissions and the responses by the committee. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Before we move to the next I need to change gadgets. It's load shedding. Thank you.